Hello. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adnan Ashfaq, founder director of Simply Medical Limited. Today, I'll be presenting to you an introduction to IEC 62304, software development lifecycle processes. And before I do go into detail of the standard, I'd just like to give you a brief overview just of the context of 6234 and software as a medical device. And there's much to discuss. And before I go into the standard, we'll go into a short background. And apologies if previous speakers have covered some of these areas, but I think it's very important to try and place the standard into context. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview. I have had some technical issues today, so I've had to resort to a PDF as opposed to using Microsoft PowerPoint, which is what I would normally do. So let's hope this can work. I put this into full screen mode. Okay, so to move on, the brief that I've been given is that the Ministry of Health would like an online training to provide an understanding of medical device software and how to comply with the regulatory requirements. And through this training, participants will be able to understand the role of medical device software, standards, and issues related to medical device software. And the objectives would then cover raising awareness to establish common understanding for medical device software, to do this in compliance with the regulation of medical devices, and to improve the understanding and the requirements for medical device software. So just as a background, as I mentioned earlier, I would just like to go back and wind back. So where and how did we get to the position that we're in present modern day 21st century? Basic medical devices have been around since from millennia, as early as 7000 BC, with flint tip drills and bowstrings used in dentistry, and other examples such as in ancient Egypt, ants were used for wound closure prior to sutures being invented. At these times, of course, there were no regulations, and it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that the US introduced the Medical Device Amendments for Safety and Effectiveness of Medical Devices. And in Europe, it wasn't until 1993 that the Medical Devices Directive were formed, and prior to this, there was very little regulation for the safety of medical devices. So we can see as technology has advanced, the need for more formal regulations is necessary, and these have advanced considerably unto present date. So why the change in Europe from 1993? Firstly, the need for public safety to become more transparent has been called for, and this has been a result of a spate of cases where individuals in the global community have been traumatized or even died due to the failure of the efficacy of a medical device, which may not have been tested appropriately. Secondly, which is the point that I'm focusing on today, just during this presentation, is due to the leap in the technological advancement, the directive was then outdated and didn't accommodate some of these recent developments in technology, specifically in nanotechnology, software, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, etc. These are some areas where really the directives have been left behind, and we needed a much more up-to-date regulation. And as a result, this had really tightened up the development of medical devices and eliminates the weak from the strong, resulting in businesses which are really focused on patient safety and building in a level of high quality from concept. Due to the significant challenges that the medical device world brings, many of the engagements I have at Simply Medica are companies who try to avoid being a medical device, but during those conversations, it then becomes very apparent that they are developing a medical device, but then try and avoid it just because of the complications, the cost, etc. But then when we drill down to the clinical claims, it's very obvious then that it's difficult to avoid the medical devices sector, and it then becomes a commercial or legal risk that the manufacturers have to then consider. So if we briefly look at the medical device definition from the EU perspective and the US perspective, we'll see three terms are missing and not in completion within the FDA definition. I'll avoid reading the entire page, but I think it's important just for the first paragraph just to note a medical device means any instrument, apparatus, appliance, and software which is included here implant, reagent, material, or other article intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings for one or more of the following specific medical devices. And it then outlines these four main bullet points here, the first of which are diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, prediction and prognosis, treatment or alleviation of disease. And I've specifically called out these three because in software examination or software medical devices, these are three concepts which run through commonly through the medical device's intended purpose. Either it's performing some kind of monitoring, prediction, or prognosis. It can be, of course, some of the other terms that have been used here, but these are specifically missed out on the next slide. You'll see they're not present in the medical device definition, which states the following. So I'll just leave this on the slide just for a few seconds for the audience to read. And I would also say that the wording from the European regulation that I just showed in the previous slide is very carefully worded, and it almost or entirely, in my experience, covers every potential angle that a medical device developer would face if the product is a medical device, and it then becomes very difficult to avoid because of the terminology used in the previous slide. And it's perhaps something that the FDA need to tighten up and improve on the definition because of these changes in technology. So let's move into the 62304 standard. We see this V model. Apologies if the text is very brief, but I'll just talk through it briefly. So the V model begins with the customer needs and then looks at the software development activities, including risk management and the software risk management, which is one of the areas which I usually mention to my clients to begin with as a first area of activity to try and identify the risks, because it does two things. First of all, it will classify the safety of your medical device, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, where there's different classifications of safety. But the second thing it also does is it classifies the medical device as a whole, assuming at this point that the device or product is actually a medical device, because we've now gone past the medical device's definition. We are now looking at the classification of software and then classification of the medical device. In the US, where there's three classifications, in Europe, there's four classifications, 1, 2A, 2B, and Class 3. We then look at software development planning, software requirements analysis, software architectural design, software detail design, software unit implementation and verification, software integration and integration testing, software system testing, and finally, software release. And then we also have software configuration management and software problem resolution. This slide, I just want to make sure and illustrate, it provides a very clear illustration. In order to implement medical device software, it shows the relationship of the different standards, which this diagram comes directly from the 62304 standard. And it implies here you have ISO 14971, ISO 13485, which is the cornerstone of quality management system, 14971, which is the risk management standard. Depending on the nature of the device, if there are electromechanical, electrical safety required, then 60601, 61010. And then also some of these other standards, which also could involve cybersecurity and other areas which are required for the implementation of medical device software. So then we move on to 60601, which I'm going to talk about very briefly because it's not the focus of this presentation, but it is important if there are electrical requirements and you need to see the relationship and look at the safety from an energy source, and then also look at the risks involved from electrical safety level. The flowchart here can be of use, which also looks at the intended purpose and the use defined, possible sources of hazard and which have been identified, the hazard related to the handling of the medical data, identify the known and reasonable misuses or hazards, Is the hazard covered by relevant safety standards? If yes, then verify according to the relevant safety standard. If no, the next question then is, does the device provide medical relevant data? If it's yes, then use ISO 14971 for risk management. If it's no, then select an applicable method for risk control based on safety standard. And then following through, does the software have any impact on the medical data? If it's no, then again, select applicable method. If it's yes, then use of procedures required to verify the data. And if it's no, then use 62304. And if it's yes, then additional requirements necessary to ensure that wrong data are selected prior to use of data for medical purposes. So it's really pointing towards 62304 if they are depending on risk. And this is why I say that risk management is very important to begin as one of the prime and foremost activities in the development of your software. So one of the other things is that the company that's implementing the software development must have an SDLC, software development lifecycle procedure, and it must describe and provide instruction for and identify responsibilities for the software development lifecycle activities in conformance with the standard. These procedures are built around the software development lifecycle model, a conceptual structure spanning the life of the software from definition of its requirements to its release, which then firstly identifies the processes, the activities, and the tasks involved in the development of the medical device software. It describes the sequence of and the dependency between activities and tasks. It identifies the milestones at which completeness of specified deliverables is verified. Okay. So the scope of the procedure should be for design and development of new medical device software, and it also should include the modifications and upgrades of an existing medical device software. So it's looking at the entire life cycle of the medical device software, but also post-market, where there could be some modifications. So having a look at some definitions, these definitions are very, very important, in fact, and often there can be lots of confusion, and it's very important to look back at the standard. These definitions are clearly written within the standard, so you can use the standard for these definitions, because as a reminder, we need to understand what is the software item. Throughout this standard, it talks about these things, systems, a unit, software unknown provenance, soup. Unfortunately, we're not talking about noodles or chicken soup here. It's software of unknown provenance. So it's important to have a look at some of these definitions, which we'll cover in the next slides. So as I said, let's come back to risk management. And I briefly touched upon the safety classifications earlier on. And there's 3 software safety classifications, A, B, and C. C being the highest, B is the middle one, and A is the least of the safety classifications. And the way the standard drives the medical device developer is that Class C is by default selected. So it's the highest risk. And then we need to answer the following questions to see whether we can de-risk or classify other than a C, which is ultimately leading towards serious injury or death. And these questions are very important. Can a hazardous situation arise from a failure of the software? If it's yes, then evaluate the effectiveness of risk control measures external to the software. There's something missing, because in the standard there is a definition of what does it mean to external to the software, and that's really important because it comes up in my conversation all of the time. And external to the software can actually be a clinician who makes the decision. So for instance, if you have an algorithm or machine learning which is making decisions, there's a much higher risk involved, as opposed to if somebody else is making the decision from clinical information or data which is being provided to the clinician. So therefore the risk is much lower. And then the next question then, here we see, does failure of the software result in unacceptable risk, and what severity of injury is possible? And if the answer is serious injury or death, then it's a Class C. If it's non-serious injury, it's Class B. And if there's no injury or death or non-serious injury, then it's a Class A. So it's very important to outline the safety and the risk concern from the device itself. Now I'm putting on the screen here the FDA level of concern, and the reason why I do this is because unlike the software safety classification A, B, and C from 62304, the FDA do this in a slightly different way, which is aligned to the 62304 standard, but they look at it from a minor, a moderate, and a major. So the equivalent is, for example, the Class A, which we looked at earlier on, is equivalent to a minor. Class B, what we looked at before, is a moderate, and they say a major, which is the Class C, which is the highest classification. And the definition here is level of concern refers to an estimate of the severity of injury that a device could permit or inflict either directly or indirectly on a patient or operator as a result of device failures, design flaws, or simply by virtue of employing the device for its intended use. And again, I must also emphasize the importance of beginning with a robust intended use and one that will identify clinical claims, the intended users, the intended environment of where the operating environment would be, all of these things. And in fact, if you want to know a good source for writing an intended use statement, you should look at the definition of intended use in ISO 14971, which outlines the different elements of intended use, and that will give you a much more detailed statement. So the three definitions are detailed further here: major, moderate, and minor, determining the levels of concern. And because of the interest of time, I'm going to skip on to the next. So major level of concern, if the answer to any one of the questions below is yes, the level of concern for the software device is likely to be major. So the questions here are slightly different to what we saw earlier on from 62304, but it's also interesting just to focus and have a look at these different questions. Does the software device qualify as blood establishment computer software? Question number 2, is the software device intended to be used in combination with a drug or biologic? Question 3, is the software device an accessory to a medical device that has a major level of concern? And question 4, prior to mitigation of hazards, could a failure of the software result in death or serious injury either to a patient or to the user of the device? Example of this includes the following. A, does the software device control a life-supporting or life-sustaining function? Does the software device control the delivery of potentially harmful energy that could result in death or serious injury, such as radiation, treatment systems, defibrillators, and ablation generators? Does the software device control the delivery of treatment or therapy such that an error or malfunction could result in death or serious injury? Does the software device provide diagnostic information that directly derives a decision regarding treatment or therapy, such that if misapplied, it could result in serious injury or death? And finally, does the software device provide vital signs monitoring and alarms for potentially life-threatening situations in which medical intervention is necessary? And then we have a look at the moderate questions. Is this software device an accessory to a medical device that has a moderate level of concern? Number 2, prior to mitigation of hazards, could a failure of software device result in minor injury either to a patient or a user of a device? And apologies at the typo, it should be 3. Could a malfunction or a latent design flaw in the software device lead to an erroneous diagnosis or a delay in delivery of inappropriate medical care that would likely lead to minor injury? If any of these questions have been answered no, then the device, the software is minor. So the software-related documentation shall be provided in the pre-market submission or FDA approval, which shall be consistent with the intended use of the software device, the level of concern, and the type of submission. And there's a reference here for industry and FDA staff. The document, which is titled Guidance for the Content of Pre-Market Submissions for Software Contained in Medical Devices, specifically pages 9 to 10, Table 3 for guidance on the requirements for documentation based on level of concern. Okay, now that we've covered safety classification, let's move on to software lifecycle processes, which will look at these 5 elements. So first of all, software development. Software development itself requires planning, a software development plan requirements, software requirements analysis, software architectural design, software detail design, software unit implementation, software integration and integration testing, software system testing, and software release. So to begin with, looking at the software development plan, it's very important that the organization has a development plan which will explain the different activities that the development will cover, the deliverables, the traceability, software configuration and change management, software problem resolution. And as any plan, you can also, throughout the development, change various elements of the development lifecycle, and it's very important that the plan is then treated as a dynamic document and not static, and make sure that you keep your plan updated as development proceeds. So software development plan requirements, reference to system requirements and procedures for coordinating the software with the system development. Also reference software verification plans, reference software risk management plans, include information about the documents to be produced during the software development lifecycle, so deliverables, and reference to software configuration management information. Further software development plan requirements for Class B and C. So you'll see in the following slides now, you'll see highlighted in brackets the different classification B, C, or if it's A, B, and C, depending on what the outcome was when we did the safety classification in the initial slides which I discussed, or the levels of concern. 62304 allows for flexibility on activities. If the classification is B and C, then there's much more activity that needs to be done. And if it's C, then there's a little bit more that needs to be done. But generally, there's for B and C's, there's a lot more activities that need to be covered. And this means that if it's a Class A device that's been identified, some of these other activities don't need to be done. And this can then become more of an individual choice rather than a specific requirement. The reason why I mention individual choice is because in many conversations with developers, it almost becomes nonsensical not to have some of these documents, and we'll see further on in some of these examples where it's very important to have documents where the standard says it's for B and C, but it doesn't mention it for A. So it's more mandatory for these different classifications. Okay, so moving on then to software requirements analysis. So in the software requirements analysis, it's very important that you define and document what the software system requirements are from system level requirements. So the software requirements which need to include the following. So you have to have your functional and capability requirements, your software system inputs and outputs, the interfaces between the software system and other systems, software-driven alarms, any warnings, and operator messages, any security requirements, any user interface requirements implemented by the software, any data definition and database requirements, installation and acceptance requirements of the delivered medical device software at the operation and maintenance site or sites, requirements related to methods of operation and maintenance, requirements related to IT network aspects, user maintenance requirements, and regulatory requirements. And then finally, risk control measures implemented in software, which again, as I said before, it's only mentioned for Class B and C. So software requirements analysis continued. Reevaluate risk analysis when software requirements are established and updated as appropriate. And you're going to see risk analysis mentioned throughout this slide deck. And because it is imperative that risk is inherently embedded into all of the activities within software development, then reevaluate and update requirements as appropriate as a result of software requirements analysis activity. Verify and document that the software requirements, first of all, implement system requirements, including those relating to risk control. Secondly, do not contradict one another. Thirdly, are expressed in terms that avoid ambiguity. Fourth, are stated in terms that permit establishment of test criteria and performance of tests. 5, can be uniquely identified. And finally, are traceable to system requirements or another source. Okay, so software architectural design, this is probably one of the elements that I would say is very difficult to avoid regardless of classification, although it's identified in IEC 62304 as class B and C only. I think it only makes sense regardless of what type of software you're developing or designing, that you have a software architecture document that clearly outlays how you're going to build, develop the device, what the integration is, from SOUP items, software of unknown provenance, where it could be external software which you're using. How does it integrate to your software? And all the different components, how they relate to one another, is very important, I think, to outline this type of document. And as mentioned before, the software item, which is identified as SOUP, it identifies functional and performance requirements that are necessary for its intended use, which needs to be specified. And then, of course, if there's any system hardware, you also need to identify how that's interlinked. And then verify the software architecture, which will then look at the software, how it implements systems and requirements, including those related to risk control. And what the architecture, how it is able to support interfaces between software items and the hardware, and then a medical device architecture which supports proper operation of any SOUP items. Then we move on to software detail design. Any segregation between software items that is necessary to risk control shall be identified, and the process to ensure that segregation is effective shall be stated class C only. Okay, so maybe there's some room here for missing out some activities. Here, class B and C, again, software shall be subdivided and it's represented by software units. And for software detail design, again, for class C only, the organization shall do the following. Design shall be developed and documented with enough detail to allow correct implementation of each software unit. A design for interfaces between the software and external components as any interfaces shall be developed and documented with enough detail to implement and interfaces correctly. In order to verify the software detail design, it shall be verified and documented that it implements the software architecture and is free from contradiction with the software architecture. And then we move on to software unit implementation. Implement all software units for class B and C again. Strategies, methods, and procedures for verifying the software units. Where verification is done by testing, the test procedures shall be evaluated for adequacy. And B, acceptance criteria for software units prior to integration into larger software items as appropriate, and ensure that software units meet acceptance criteria. For class C software, there's some additional work that needs to be done, such as proper event sequence, data and control flow, planned resource allocation, fault handling, initialization of variables, self-diagnostics, memory management and memory overflows, and boundary conditions. And then software unit verification, perform software unit verification and document the results. Software integration and testing. Software units shall be integrated in accordance with the integration plan. So assuming that you've got an integration plan, you shall then verify any records of the evidence such that verification shall be retained. Integrated software items shall be tested in accordance with the integration plan and results shall be documented. For software integration testing, the integrated software item shall be addressed to verify it performs as intended. And then integration test procedures shall be evaluated for adequacy. When software items are integrated, regression testing shall be conducted to demonstrate that defects have not been introduced into previously integrated software. The integration test record content should have the test result, pass, fail, and also list the anomalies if there are any. And you should also possibly even rate the anomalies, possibly in terms of risk. Retain sufficient records to permit the test to be repeated, and of course identify the tester, which is only good document practice. Any anomalies found during software integration and integration testing shall be entered into a software problem resolution process. So this is like post-market surveillance, also complaints, feedback, this type of thing, and how you will be dealing with this process. So again, the software system testing, establish and perform a set of tests for conducting software system testing is such that all software requirements are covered. Evaluate the adequacy of verification strategies and test procedures, and enter anomalies that have been found during the software system testing into the software problem resolution process. Retesting after changes. When changes are made during software system testing, repeat tests, perform modified tests, or perform additional tests as appropriate to verify the effectiveness of the change in correcting the problem. Conduct testing appropriate to demonstrate the unintended side effects have not been introduced, and perform relevant risk management activities as in 7.4 of EN 62304. Evaluate the appropriateness of verification strategies and test procedures to make sure that all software requirements have been tested or otherwise verified. The traceability between software requirements and tests or other verifications recorded, and then the test results meet the required pass-fail criteria. So what should be the test record contents for the software system testing? Reference to test case procedures showing required actions and expected results. Test results themselves, the version of the software that's being tested, relevant hardware and software test configurations, any relevant test tools that you're using, the date that you did the testing, and the identity of the person responsible for executing the test and recording the test results. Again, this is common good documentation practice. Then we get to software release. Ensure that all software verification have been completed and results have been evaluated before the software is released. And you can do that with a soft release statement, which can be like a checklist. Before you release the software, what kind of things have been tested and evaluated from common practice. And then document all known residual anomalies. In the case of Class B in software, evaluate anomalies to ensure that they do not contribute to an unacceptable risk. Document the version of the medical device software that is being released. And in the case of Class B and C, the procedure and environment used to create the release software. And ensure that for B and C, all software development plan or maintenance plan activities and tasks are complete, along with all the associated documentation. And then archive the software product and configuration items, all of the documentation for the lifetime of the software as a medical device product, or a time specified by relevant regulatory authorities requirements. So, assuring reliable delivery of release software. You should have a procedure also in your quality management system, which ensures that release medical device software can be reliably delivered to the point of use without corruption or unauthorized change. And this is normal in any medical device industry hardware software, where you should have some kind of final inspection or final acceptance inspection. Normally, the quality management system that we would implement at Simply Medical would include a package of procedures which would have a software development lifecycle procedure, which is general and very detailed, but then also having a separate procedure for various other elements that we're describing and discussing today, including final acceptance software release. These procedures shall address the production and handling of the media containing the medical device software, including replication, media labeling, packaging, protection, storage, and delivery as appropriate. And don't forget that even although we are software, there's also e-labeling and e-IFUs and all these type of things that are important. The protection and storage and delivery is probably less important if it's software which is being saved by a cloud or any other media like this, where unless there's CD-ROMs or DVDs or this type of thing that's being used, then there's more question around packaging and protection and storage. So moving now on to software maintenance. So for software maintenance, these 5 elements will be looked at: modification, implementation, or rather starting with a software maintenance plan, documentation and evaluation of feedback, change request, communicate with users and regulators, and modification implementation. So what does the software maintenance plan mean? What does it include? The plan should have the following. It should have a procedure for receiving, documenting, evaluating, resolving, and tracking feedback arising after release of the medical device software. So now we're into post-market activities. Criteria for determining whether feedback is considered to be a problem. Number 3, use of the software risk management process. Then use of the software problem resolution process for analyzing and resolving problems arising after release of the medical device software. Then we have use of the software configuration management process for managing modification to the existing software system. And then finally, procedures to evaluate and implement upgrades, bug fixes, patches, and obsolescence of SOUP. Problem and modification analysis. Documentation and evaluation of feedback, monitor the feedback on release software from both inside its own organization and from users. Document and evaluate feedback to determine whether a problem exists in a released medical device software. Record any problems as a problem report. Problem reports shall include actual or potential adverse events and deviation from specifications, and evaluate each problem report to determine how it affects the safety of the released medical device software and whether a change to that software is needed to address the problem. And then use the software problem resolution process to address any problem reports. Change requests. Analyze each change request for its effect on the organization, the released medical device software, and systems with which it interfaces. Change requests which modify released medical device software should be evaluated and approved. And then communication with users and regulators. Make sure to keep users and regulators informed about any problem in the released medical device software and consequences of continued unchanged use. The nature of any available changes to release software products and how to obtain and install the changes. So this is the point within the quality management system. If you're implementing ISO 13485, then you should have some kind of communication to regulatory authorities. And if you have any changes, what is identified or defined even as a significant change or substantial change, where it could affect the intended purpose. Then we have modification implementation. Identify and perform any software development activities that need to be repeated as a result of the modification. Modifications should be released in accordance with the software release procedures. Now let's move on to software risk management. It may sound a little bit back to front because we've been discussing software risk management so much, but now we get on to software risk management. And we look at analysis of software contributing to hazardous situations, risk control measures, verification of risk control measures, and then document traceability. So analysis of software contributing to hazardous situations. Um, what I often try to uh, um, discuss with clients is to make sure that you have some kind of use flow, uh, process flow chart, and which has all of the step-by-step stages of how the user would use the software. From the moment the machine is started, you're logging on to some system with user credentials, password, and then following on from there, what would be the sequence of events? I see that as an imperative task, that the sequence of events is outlined in any risk management process, regardless of software, that you can carefully analyze and evaluate what could be the potential risks um, by the user or users and possible foreseeable misuse. So it's very important to outline this because you'll be looking at incorrect or incomplete specification of functionality, any software defects which have been identified, any failure or unexpected results from SOUP, from the external software, um, hardware failures or other software defects that could result in unpredictable software operation, and then reasonably foreseeable misuse. If failure or unexpected results from SOUP is a potential cause of the software item contributing to a hazardous situation, evaluate any anomaly list published by the supplier of the SOUP item that's being used to determine if any of the known anomalies result in a sequence of events that could result in a hazardous situation, and then document potential causes of the software item contributing to a hazardous situation in the risk management file. Then we have risk control measures, again, class B and C, but maybe also worthwhile having a look at just as a general exercise for risk management, even if it's a class A. My advice is to still to perform this activity. For each case documented in the risk management file where a software item could contribute to hazardous situation, risk control measures shall be defined in accordance with ISO 14971. If the risk control measure is implemented as part of the function of the software item, then include the risk control measure in software requirements, assign to it each software item that contributes to the implementation, and then also the safety classification based on that risk, and then develop the software item in accordance with clause 5 or 62304. And then verification of the risk control measures, document them individually, and then review the risk control measure and determine if it could result in a new hazardous situation. Again, this is common risk management practice. And then documenting traceability. Again, this is identified for class B and C. Document the traceability of software hazards from the hazardous situation to the software item, from the software item to the specific software cause, from the software cause to the risk control measure, and from the risk control measure to the verification of the risk control measure. Risk management of software changes, analyze any changes to the medical device software, including SOUP. You should be looking at any hazardous situation, any new situations that have been caused by the introduction of any changes, and then any additional measures that need to be put in place because of that new risk. So let's have a look at software configuration management. Again, because 62304 is such a vast topic, this is something that we can talk about a lot in detail, but because of the limitation of time, we are looking at this as an overview. Software configuration management involves in configuration identification, change control, and configuration status accounting. So configuration identification requires establishing a scheme for the unique identification of those items and the versions to be controlled according to the development and configuration plans. For each SOUP configuration item being used includes standard libraries. Make sure to document the title, the manufacturer, and the unique SOUP designator. Also document the set of configuration items and their versions that comprise the software system configuration. So change control configuration items to be controlled using according to 8.1 of 62304. And changes shall be implemented as specified in the change request. Any activities that need to be repeated as a result of the change shall be identified and performed, including changes to the software safety classification of software systems and software items. And just also to point out, the change request, whether you should fill this out as a form, should be part of your quality management system of ISO 13485. And then verify the changes, including repeating any verification that has been invalidated by the change and taking into account 5.7.3 and 9.7 of the standard. Maintain records of relationships and dependencies between change requests, relevant problem reports, and approval of the change request. Configuration status accounting. Retain retrievable records of history of control configuration items, including system configuration. And now moving on to software problem resolution. Problem reports preparation, that's not something that we need to do. Problem investigation, maintaining records, verification of software problem resolution, and test documents, test documentation contents. We'll have a look at these areas. And very much this is a post-market activity. So first of all, when the problem reports are being prepared, in fact, you should have some kind of log, like a complaints log, a problem reports log, that you can record what the potential problem is or what complaint or feedback has been reported. Then there should be some kind of statement of criticality, as well as other information that may aid in the resolution of the problem. And this is a bit like doing a root cause analysis or investigation. It may be something that can be incorporated into your CAPA system, into your corrective action, preventive action, where you have investigation, evaluation, and documentation, and then creating the change request. And then also advising relevant parties of the existence of the problem as appropriate. And then all change requests shall be approved and implemented, observing the requirements of the change control process. Maintaining records of problem records and their resolution, including the verification and update risk management files, also as appropriate. So never forget your risk management file. As I've been emphasizing throughout this presentation, risk management is a common theme which is always required at any device development, hardware or software or both. Perform an analysis to detect trends in problem reports. And then verification of software problem resolution to determine whether the problem has been resolved and a problem report has been closed. Any adverse trends that have been reversed. Change requests have been implemented in the appropriate software products and activities, and additional problems have been introduced. Test documentation contents. When testing or retesting or regression testing software items following a change, include the following in the test documentation: the test results, any anomalies that have been found, the version of the software that's been tested, the relevant hardware and software test configurations, any relevant test tools, the date of the testing, and identification of the tester. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to IMDRF. I think it's important just to have a look at IMDRF because these guidance documents are also very important. I'm kind of transitioning now from 62304 into different regulations to see how 62304 fits in to a much more global perspective. So although 62304 remains as the cornerstone of implementation for software as a medical device, it's also useful that there are industry guidelines or documents which IMDRF, which some of you might be familiar with, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, have formulated these documents. And there are 4 documents which are mentioned at the bottom point, which is the IMDRF, which is chaired by the FDA, and the 4 documents are titled Key Definitions framework for risk categorization, the quality management system, and clinical evaluation of software as a medical device. I think they're also useful as supplementary documents to 62304. Sometimes if you look at 62304 and the IMDRF documents, there can be some confusion specifically with the risk categorization document, but I think it's definitely worthwhile having a look at these documents. And the quality management system is probably quite useful because 62304 doesn't really give you much advice on implementation in your QMS from a software perspective. And then also clinical evaluation is quite useful, although there are European guidelines for CE marking, which the MDCG guidance documents also provide further information. So post-market activities, as you can see, there's these different elements which need to be followed: new features, corrected errors or faults, any impact on safety, updates to the medical device software, and updates in accompanying documents. Decommissioning and disposal of the medical software product. The user or responsible organization shall be able to safely decommission and dispose of the medical software product at the end of its useful life, including, where appropriate, safeguarding personal and health-related data in connection with security and privacy. So this is probably where cybersecurity is also a very important element. And the medical device software shall provide the function consistent with applicable use requirement as specified in 5.1. Now moving over to the EU MDR, just to give you some pointers towards medical device software. The EU MDR 20177745 itself has little or no guidance on how to perform software validation. As I mentioned, the MDCG guidance documents are being very useful. However, the FDA guidelines have been used up until the point where these MDCG guidance documents have been released. This is probably a slightly outdated statement, and I would say the MDCG guidance documents would definitely be supportive of the medical device regulation itself. The MDR describes legislative acts and mentions it is necessary to clarify that software in its own right, when specifically intended by the manufacturer to be used for one or more of the medical purposes set out in the definition of medical devices, qualifies as a medical device, while software for general purposes, even when used in a healthcare setting, or software intended for lifestyle and well-being purposes, is not a medical device. The qualification of software, either as a device or an accessory, is independent of the software's location or the type of interconnection between the software and a device. One standard which I've hesitated to mention here is 82304, which is a much more generic standard which is being used for health software, but it's also worthwhile having a look at. But again, 62304 is the appropriate standard to have a look at for software as a medical device. EU MDR Article 2 definitions, which we've already had a look at earlier on, so I'm going to skip this slide. This is a definition for a medical device, which, again, as mentioned before, indicates software. Section 6 of the MDR, product verification and validation, describes documentation which shall contain results and critical analysis of all V&V tests, verification validation tests, are undertaken to demonstrate conformity of the device with the requirements of this regulation, and in particular, the general safety and performance requirements which need to be covered. And then there's also preclinical and clinical data, software verification validation, which describes the software design and development process and evidence of the validation of software as used in the finished device. This information shall typically include the summary results of all verification, validation, and testing performed both in-house and in a simulated or actual user environment prior to final release. It shall also address all of the different hardware configurations and, where applicable, operating systems identified in the information supplied by the manufacturer. So making sure that all of these areas are looked at, so even the operating system as well. If you change from one operating system to another one, it's also important that might be something that you have to have a look at as a change release, change request, which is why it's sensible to try and identify as many operating systems at the outset. Section 3.2.5 of the MDR then looks at personnel responsible, such as technical documentation reviews or type examination, including clinical evaluation, biological safety, sterilization, and software validation shall have the following proven qualifications. So there is an imposition of qualifications and experience that one should have in implementing such reviews of software validation. And it's also a very important point. And then we have the classification rules, and Rule 11 is the new rule that was introduced by the MDR, which is for standalone software. And it almost becomes very, very difficult for any software as a medical device to be classified as a class 1. In my experience, almost all software is being used to provide some level of information, which is then used to take decisions either with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes, which then makes it automatic that it's classified as a 2A, except if such decisions have any impact that then there is death or irreversible deterioration of person's state of health, which then becomes a class 3. Now, this is the reason why we talked earlier on about the safety classifications, risk management, classification, safety class A, B, C, or minor, moderate, major, and then also performing the risk assessment to identify what possible risks could occur by foreseeable misuse of the software or by any failure of the software, which could lead to any of these areas where it could lead to death or serious injury or minor injury, where the classification of the overall medical device would then be affected and would become either a class 2B or a class 3. And then finally, this last point here, and then all other software is classified as class 1. And as I said before, I work with many companies, and it's in my experience of the last few years, it's become almost impossible to identify any software which is being developed as a class 1. Because of this wording here, providing information. And this is illustrated in the same information, but in a different format. And of course, Rule 11 comes under active devices. So classifications must be defined by risk. And once we determine the risk in the classification, a course of action can be taken using 14971 62304, and then utilizing the standards such as 62304, and then also some of these other standards here. So software and medical devices must also apply 62366, which we didn't mention earlier on, but it's also a very important standard to look at usability engineering. And then some of these other standards which are also very important. And 80002 specifically looks at risk management from software perspective. So it's also advisable to have a look at 80002 in addition to 14971, even although 14971 is really incorporated into 80002, it's worthwhile having a look at both. So finally, I'm just going to conclude in conclusions that the documents that the manufacturer should produce are the software development plan, software classification document, the SOUP declaration, the software configuration management plan, the software requirements, the software risk analysis, the software defects analysis, software systems testing, any software anomalies, a maintenance plan, problem reporting, traceability matrix, and software release. So, in conclusion, what do you need to do next? Start building your design history file or technical file. Begin with your risk management. Develop a usability file, and then start developing your software development file. Of course, based on everything that we've discussed this afternoon, hopefully this provides you some kind of insight. The regulatory hurdles, the hoops, the complications, the complexities around developing a medical device. And that really concludes my presentation. And thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to a discussion or any questions, any queries, and any challenges that you are facing. We can have that discussion. So I'm going to conclude here. Thank you.